starting with number 1 Brewster Buffalo, United States, 1939. The Brewster Buffalo entered service with quiet confidence, but it was a machine that had already been overtaken by the pace of war before it ever saw combat. Built for carrier operations, it was fat, underpowered, and structurally overweight by the time it reached frontline units. Finnish pilots flew it with some success against older Soviet aircraft, but when British Commonwealth pilots took it into the skies over Malaya and Burma against the Japanese Zero, the results were catastrophic. Of 60 Buffaloes committed to the defense of Malaya, the vast majority were lost within weeks. Pilots described it as sluggish on the controls, dangerously slow in a climb, and nearly impossible to maneuver against a competent opponent. One British pilot bluntly noted it was suitable only for a pilot with a death wish. The aircraft's engine consistently overheated in tropical conditions, compounding an already dire tactical situation. 2. Blackburn Botha, United Kingdom, 1940. Britain's Blackburn Botha was conceived as a torpedo bomber and coastal patrol aircraft, but it arrived as something closer to a liability. Introduced in 1940, it suffered immediately from a fundamental mismatch between its airframe and its engines. The two Bristol Persis motors were simply too weak to haul the aircraft's weight effectively, leaving it dangerously underpowered during takeoff, a critical phase for any aircraft operating over open water. Pilots found the handling unpredictable, the visibility poor, and the aircraft's tendency to swing violently on takeoff deeply unnerving. More Bothas were lost in training accidents than in any operational context. The RAF quietly retired it from frontline duties within a year, but not before it had killed a significant number of the crews assigned to learn it. 3. Ferry Battle, United Kingdom, 1937. The ferry battle was not designed for the war it was forced to fight. When it entered service in 1937, it was a modern monoplane, a step forward from the biplanes it replaced. But by May 1940, when British and Commonwealth crews flew it against German columns advancing through Belgium and France, it was hopelessly outclassed. Slow, lightly armed, and with almost no defensive capability, battle crews were sent on low-level bombing missions against heavily defended bridges and road columns. The losses were staggering. On the 12th of May 1940, 5 battles attacked the Maastricht bridges. None returned. Crews knew what they were flying into. The casualty rate among battle squadrons in the opening weeks of the Western Campaign was among the highest of any Allied aircraft type in the entire war. Pilots didn't hate the airframe. They feared the mission the airframe forced them to fly. 4. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, United States, 1943. The Curtiss Helldiver was meant to replace the beloved SBD Dauntless, but the men asked to fly it spent years wishing the Dauntless had never been retired. Development of the Helldiver was plagued by design revisions, structural failures, and engine problems that delayed its introduction by over a year. When it finally reached fleet squadrons in 1943, pilots found it heavy on the controls, prone to instability in the dive, and equipped with landing gear that collapsed with disturbing regularity during carrier landings. Deck crews despised maintaining it. Pilots gave it nicknames that cannot be repeated in polite company, the most printable being the Beast. Its dive brakes buffeted violently, disorienting pilots at the most critical moment of an attack run. Despite its flaws, it participated in nearly every major Pacific carrier operation from late 1943 onward, simply because there was nothing else available in sufficient numbers. 5. Avro Manchester, United Kingdom, 1940. The Avro Manchester is perhaps the clearest example in the RAF's wartime history of an aircraft that should never have entered operational service in the condition it did. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine, a design that was fundamentally unreliable throughout its service life, the Manchester suffered catastrophic engine failures at an alarming rate. Crews flying night bombing missions over occupied Europe already faced lethal odds from flak and night fighters. The prospect of losing an engine over Germany added a layer of dread that commanders could not ignore. Over 50 Manchesters were lost to engine-related causes or accidents in a period of less than 18 months. Bomber command crews quietly dreaded assignment to Manchester squadrons. The aircraft was mercifully withdrawn in 1942, its failure directly accelerating the development of the four-engine Avro Lancaster built around the same basic airframe, a grim silver lining to an operational disaster. 7. Boulton-Paul Defiant, United Kingdom, 1937. The Boulton-Paul Defiant was built around a tactical concept that made sense on a drawing board but collapsed entirely in combat. Its designers removed the forward-firing armament entirely, placing all firepower in a powered dorsal turret behind the pilot. The theory was that it would attack bombers from below or alongside, where turret guns could be brought to bear. German pilots quickly learned to attack from the front and below, angles the Defiant could not effectively answer. During the Battle of Britain, Defiant squadrons suffered losses so severe that within weeks the aircraft was withdrawn from daylight operations entirely. 11 aircraft were lost in a single day over Dunkirk. Pilots understood the machine's fundamental vulnerability, but had no tactical solution available to them. It survived the war in a night fighter role where its turret limitations mattered less, but as a daylight fighter it had been a catastrophe. 8. Heinkel He-177 Greif, Germany, 1942. Germany's Heinkel He-177 was the Luftwaffe's attempt to field a long-range heavy bomber, and it became one of the most dangerous aircraft to its own crews in the entire war. Its most infamous design choice was the coupling of two engines together to drive a single propeller on each wing, an arrangement intended to reduce drag but which created horrific overheating and a persistent tendency to catch fire in flight. Crews nicknamed it the Flying Lighter. Luftwaffe personnel assigned to He-177 units were not subtle about their fears. Engine fires on operational missions were not rare occurrences, but near routine hazards. Over 100 He-177s were lost to mechanical failures and in-flight fires. Structurally, the airframe was also required to perform dive bombing, placing enormous stress on wings not truly designed for the task. It was an aircraft that fought its own crew as much as any enemy. 9. Messerschmitt Me-210 Germany, 1941. The Messerschmitt Me-210 was intended to replace the aging Me-110 heavy fighter, but it arrived as something that genuinely alarmed the pilots ordered to fly it. Severe aerodynamic instability made it unpredictable at virtually every phase of flight, takeoff, cruise, and especially landing. It had a vicious tendency to snap into a spin without adequate warning, and the stall characteristics were so violent that conversion training became a significant cause of attrition in itself. Numerous Me-210s were lost during evaluation and training before any enemy action occurred. Pilots formally protested their assignment to the type. The situation became so embarrassing that the German Air Ministry briefly forced Messerschmitt to halt production, a rare public humiliation for the company. The aircraft was substantially redesigned as the Me-410, which proved serviceable. But the original Me-210 remains a cautionary example of what happens when political pressure accelerates production past the point of safe testing. 10. Dornier Do-17 Germany, 1937. The Dornier Do-17 entered the war with a deceptively elegant nickname, the Flying Pencil, a reference to its narrow, sleek fuselage. In the early campaigns over Poland and France, its speed provided some margin of safety. But over Britain in 1940, that margin evaporated. The Do-17 carried a bomb load too small to be strategically decisive, and its defensive armament was insufficient against the Hurricanes and Spitfires it increasingly encountered. Crews found themselves flying a machine that could neither outrun modern fighters nor absorb significant punishment. As the Battle of Britain progressed, Do-17 losses mounted steadily. The crews had limited cockpit protection, and the aircraft's relatively slow maximum speed made it increasingly exposed during the long overwater approach to English targets. By 1941, it was being phased out, its operational limitations having contributed directly to the Luftwaffe's failure to suppress the RAF. 11. Fokker TV, Netherlands, 1937. The Fokker TV was the Netherlands' most capable bomber when Germany invaded in May 1940. Which was a measure of how limited Dutch air power truly was. The aircraft was slow, its defensive guns poorly positioned, and its crew found the aircraft cumbersome to operate under combat conditions. In 5 days of desperate fighting, The handful of TV bombers available flew missions against the German bridgeheads at Moordijk and Walhaven, suffering losses that the tiny Dutch Air Force could not sustain. The pilots flew with the knowledge that their machines were fundamentally outmatched, the structural limitations of the design making evasive action difficult. By the time the Netherlands capitulated, the TV had been effectively wiped out, a symbol of how outdated equipment translated directly into lives lost without strategic return. 12. Mitsubishi G4M, Japan, 1941. Japan's Mitsubishi G4M, known to Allied forces as the Betty, was fast and long-ranged, and it achieved this partly by stripping away the protection its crew desperately needed. Its fuel tanks were unprotected and unstated, meaning any incendiary fire quickly turned the aircraft into an uncontrollable inferno. American fighter pilots found it burned so readily that they called it the Flying Lighter, the same grim nickname independently earned by the German He-177. Japanese crews called it the Flying Cigar and the One-Shot Lighter. G4M crews knew their survival depended on never being hit, and in the increasingly aggressive air environment of the Pacific after 1942, that was not a condition that could be reliably maintained. Despite this, Japan continued operating the type throughout the war because no adequate replacement existed, grinding through air crews at a rate that contributed significantly to Japan's growing aviation personnel shortage. 13. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, United States, 1938. Designating the Curtiss P-40 as a failure requires careful qualification. It was not a bad aircraft in absolute terms, but it was chronically underpowered and unable to compete with contemporary German and Japanese fighters above 15,000 feet. The pilots assigned to it in the critical early years of the war in North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific knew they were flying a machine with a ceiling advantage problem that tactics alone could not fully solve. The aircraft's engine performance degraded significantly at altitude, limiting the engagement options available to its pilots. In the opening weeks of the Pacific War, P-40 pilots at Clark Field and Pearl Harbor were scrambled in aircraft fundamentally outclassed by the opposition. Pilots didn't regret every mission in the P-40, but those who flew it against late-model Japanese or German aircraft at altitude understood with cold clarity the disadvantage they carried into every engagement. 14. Hawker Typhoon, United Kingdom, 1941. The Hawker Typhoon entered service, surrounded by mechanical failures serious enough to prompt multiple proposals for its cancellation. Its Napier Sabre engine was chronically unreliable in early marks, suffering from failures that killed pilots with no enemy involvement whatsoever. More critically, the tail section had a structural weakness that caused the entire empennage to separate from the aircraft in high-speed dives, a failure mode that killed an unknown but significant number of pilots before it was identified and corrected. Carbon monoxide leaks from the engine into the cockpit were also documented, slowly incapacitating pilots on longer sorties. The aircraft's early operational record was grim enough that its future was genuinely uncertain. It survived, was refined, and eventually became one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. But the men who flew it in 1941 and early 1942 did, so knowing the machine itself was not entirely on their side. 15. Consolidated B-24 Liberator, United States, 1941. Comparing the B-24 Liberator to the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a daily exercise in dissatisfaction for the crews unfortunate enough to fly both. The Liberator was faster and longer-ranged, but structurally fragile compared to the B-17, with a high-mounted Davis wing that provided excellent aerodynamic efficiency, but proved dangerously vulnerable to battle damage. The wing's design meant that hits which a B-17 might absorb could cause a catastrophic structural failure in a B-24. Crews also found the aircraft's Davis wing gave it poor low-speed handling, making formation flying in poor weather genuinely hazardous. The bomb bay, accessed by a narrow catwalk over a pair of roller doors, was a claustrophobic nightmare for crew members working in the midst of combat. B-24 crews over Europe and the Pacific flew with the persistent awareness that their aircraft was less forgiving of damage than the plane they wished they were in. 16. Douglas TBD Devastator, United States, 1937. The Douglas TBD Devastator was already approaching obsolescence when the United States entered the war. But the scale of its failure at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 transformed it into one of the most tragic symbols of technological inadequacy in American military history. Torpedo doctrine required Devastator crews to fly straight and level at low altitude for the final approach, eliminating evasive action entirely at the most vulnerable moment. At Midway, all 3 torpedo bomber squadrons flying TBDs were effectively destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost all 15 aircraft. There was a single survivor among the aircrew. The combination of an obsolete airframe, defective torpedoes that frequently failed to detonate, and fighter cover that failed to materialize created conditions in which the crews of Devastators had minimal prospect of survival. It was withdrawn immediately after Midway, a decision that should have been made considerably earlier. 17. Savoia Marchetti SM-79 Sparviero, Italy, 1936. Italy's SM-79 Sparviero was, in the torpedo bombing role, genuinely respected. But as a conventional bomber in the early war years, it carried a burden that its crews resented daily. The trimeter design gave it a distinctive hunchback profile, and the central engine nacelle created a significant blind spot directly ahead for the pilot, who sat offset to one side. Navigation and bomb aiming were complicated by the airframe's layout, and the aircraft's defensive armament was modest against increasingly capable Allied fighters. In the Mediterranean theater, SM.79 crews flying against well-defended targets found the aircraft's structural limitations and modest speed increasingly costly. The crews who flew it over East Africa and the Mediterranean were often skilled and aggressive, but they understood they were compensating for the aircraft's deficiencies through professionalism rather than flying a machine that rewarded boldness. 18. Nakajima B-5N Kate, Japan, 1937. The Nakajima B-5N, the Kate, carried Japan's torpedo attack to Pearl Harbor and sank American battleships with devastating precision. But by the middle of the war, the aircraft that had helped define Japan's opening offensive had become a liability. Its design offered almost no armor protection for the crew and no self-sealing fuel tanks, choices made to maximize performance that proved fatal as American fighter and anti-aircraft defenses improved. Crews flying Kates on later war operations against defended fleet units faced survival odds that deteriorated month by month. The aircraft that had been a precision offensive weapon became, by 1943, a machine that sent trained and experienced Japanese naval aviators into engagements they were increasingly unlikely to survive. Japan's inability to replace it quickly enough compounded the loss of irreplaceable aircrews. 19. Vought SB-2U Vindicator, United States, 1937. The Vought SB-2U Vindicator was the U.S. Navy's first monoplane dive bomber, and by the time it was needed most, it was deeply and irreversibly obsolete. At the Battle of Midway, Marine Corps Vindicator crews were sent against the Japanese invasion fleet in aircraft that their own pilots privately regarded as coffins. The machines were slow, their dive bombing accuracy was compromised by buffeting issues, and they lacked the performance to escape Japanese Zero fighters in any phase of the engagement. Several Vindicators were lost at Midway. Others returned so badly damaged they were pushed over the side of the deck. Major Lofton Henderson, leading the Marine dive bomber attack, was killed in the opening moments of the assault. The crews knew what they were flying into. Their courage was not in question. The aircraft they flew was 20. Aviation IL-2 Sturmovik, Soviet Union, 1941. The Aviation IL-2 was one of the most produced aircraft in history and one of the most feared on the Eastern Front. But it was also one of the deadliest machines to its own crews when it was configured incorrectly. The original single-seat version left the rear of the aircraft entirely undefended, and German fighter pilots quickly learned to attack from behind. IL-2 loss rates in 1941 and early 1942 were catastrophic. Stalin's famous communication to the factories, describing the IL-2 as necessary as bread and air, reflects not admiration, but desperate urgency driven by irreplaceable losses. The two-seat version with a rear gunner corrected the most lethal vulnerability, but the rear gunner's position was lightly protected and itself carried a high casualty rate. Soviet ground attack pilots faced some of the most punishing loss rates of any aircrew in the war, flying an aircraft that was only partially suited to the conditions it was thrown into. 21. Caproni CA-313, Italy, 1940. Italy's Caproni CA-313 light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft arrived in service already compromised by the mediocrity that characterized much of the Regia Aeronautica's equipment program in the early war years. Its twin Isotofrescini engines were chronically unreliable, creating anxiety for crews operating over open water in the Mediterranean. The aircraft's defensive armament was minimal, and its bomb load was too small to inflict strategically meaningful damage on defended targets. Crews assigned to the CA.313 frequently reported mechanical difficulties that grounded aircraft at operationally inconvenient moments. In French and Norwegian service, where the aircraft was also exported, it fared little better. It occupies a space in the Regia Aeronautica's history not as a catastrophic failure, but as a quiet, grinding inadequacy, the kind that depletes operational effectiveness and crew confidence without dramatic incident. Number 22. Potez 63, France, 1938. France's Potez 63 series was meant to serve multiple roles simultaneously: fighter, bomber, reconnaissance, and in doing so served none of them with decisive effectiveness. When Germany launched a defensive in May 1940, Potez 63 crews were committed to combat in an air environment they were not equipped to dominate. The aircraft was outperformed by the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in virtually every relevant metric. French crews flew it with skill and determination, but the Potez 63 could not be flown aggressively against a competent opponent without accepting unacceptable risk. Losses mounted quickly. The aircraft's multi-role compromise had produced a machine that lacked the specialized excellence needed to survive in the intense air combat of the Western Campaign. By the time of the French armistice in June 1940, Potez 63 losses reflected the broader collapse of French air power rather than any individual tactical failure. 23. Mitsubishi Ki-21, Japan, 1938. Japan's Mitsubishi Ki-21 was the primary heavy bomber of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force in the early war years, and it carried the structural assumptions of an era that ended rapidly after 1941. Its defensive armament was limited and poorly positioned, leaving significant blind zones that Allied fighters quickly learned to exploit. Crews flying Ki-21s over China and later against Allied positions in Southeast Asia found the aircraft increasingly unable to defend itself as opposition stiffened. The cockpit offered minimal armor protection, and the fuel system lacked self-sealing capability. As American, Australian, and British fighter units improved their tactics and equipment, Ki-21 losses climbed. Japanese crews who survived early war missions in the Ki-21 and transitioned to later aircraft looked back on it as a machine whose apparent solidity masked dangerous fragility once a capable opponent was in the fight. 24. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany, 1936. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka is remembered through the terrifying imagery of its screaming dive over Warsaw and Rotterdam. And in those early campaigns, that imagery was tactically real. But the Stuka's fearsome reputation rested entirely on the condition of air superiority. And when that condition was not met, it became one of the most vulnerable combat aircraft in the European theater. Over Britain in 1940, the Stuka was effectively massacred, slow, unmaneuverable, and incapable of defending itself against modern interceptors. It suffered losses so severe during Eagle Day and subsequent attacks that it was withdrawn from the Battle of Britain within days. Pilots understood that without a fighter escort in overwhelming numbers, the Stuka was flying toward its own destruction. Its screaming Jericho trumpet was silent over Britain not because its designers had abandoned it, but because sending it back would have meant sending crews to certain death. 25. Reggiane 2000 Falco, Italy, 1939. Italy's Reggiane 2000 was, in terms of pure aerodynamics, one of the more capable fighters the Regia Aeronautica operated. Yet it was plagued by a fundamental safety problem that undermined pilot confidence from the day it entered service. Its fuel tanks were located in the wings without adequate protection, and the system was designed in a manner that made fuel management critical during maneuvering flight. pilots reported fuel starvation at tactically inconvenient moments, a fault that could produce engine failure when a pilot needed power most. The aircraft was not widely exported partly because of these operational concerns. Hungarian pilots who flew it in combat reported reasonable performance, but Italian pilots were aware that the margin for error in the RE-2000 was narrower than an aircraft with more conventional and reliable fuel systems. It was a fighter whose potential was obscured by an engineering oversight that no amount of pilot skill could fully compensate for. 26. De Woytien D-520, France 1940. The De Woytien D-520 arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of France's defeat in 1940. But the men who flew it understood they were finally in a machine competitive with the Bf-109, a distinction that made the circumstances of their defeat even harder to accept. The D-520 was not a machine pilots hated. It was a machine they were given too few of, too late, and asked to fly in conditions no fighter pilot could overcome. Its production delays meant that when it mattered most, French squadrons were still flying inferior types, while D-520s sat incomplete in factories. The pilots who did fly it in combat acquitted themselves well. The bitterness was not in the aircraft, but in the system that failed to deliver it. It stands in this record not as a failed machine, but as a symbol of what adequate production planning might have achieved. 27. Bristol Beaufort, United Kingdom, 1940. The Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber entered service with a reputation shaped by engine trouble and a training fatality rate that alarmed Coastal Command from the very beginning. Its Bristol Taurus engines were unreliable in early variants, and single-engine handling in a fully loaded torpedo configuration was described by pilots as genuinely frightening. Coastal Command crews flying anti-shipping missions over the North Sea and into the heavily defended waters around Norway operated with the knowledge that an engine failure on the outbound leg left limited options. Notable among its losses was the attack on the German battlecruiser Gneisenau at Brest in April 1941, during which Flight Sergeant Kenneth Campbell flew his Beaufort through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver a torpedo hit. He did not return. The Beaufort's engine reliability improved in later marks, but the aircraft's early operational history was defined by the gap between what was asked of it and what it could safely deliver. 28. Focke-Wulf FW-189 Uhu, Germany 1940. The Focke-Wulf FW-189 was one of the war's more unusual-looking aircraft, a twin-boom reconnaissance design with a central glazed nacelle that gave its three-man crew exceptional visibility. It was, by most accounts, reasonably effective at its intended role on the Eastern Front. But its unusual configuration made it deeply unpopular with pilots accustomed to conventional aircraft, and its handling characteristics required specific adjustment, particularly in crosswind landings where the twin-boom design produced aerodynamic behavior that surprised crews trained on normal airframes. Soviet forces made repeated and determined efforts to shoot it down, recognizing its value as an artillery spotting and reconnaissance asset. For the German crews who flew it in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, the Uhu represented the discomfort of flying something that looked and felt unlike anything they had been trained for, a psychological burden that routine competence alone could not fully address. 29. Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, Japan 1941. Japan's Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa was lightweight, maneuverable, and deeply beloved by its pilots in the early war years. And therein lay the problem. The same design choices that made it agile made it extraordinarily fragile and dangerously underarmed. Its light construction meant it could not absorb combat damage that American or British fighters routinely survived. And its armament of 2 rifle-caliber machine guns in early variants was inadequate against aircraft with self-sealing tanks and pilot armor. As the Pacific War intensified and American pilots learned to avoid low-speed turning engagements, the Ki-43's strength, and instead use hit-and-run tactics exploiting superior firepower and dive speed, the Hayabusa became increasingly lethal to its own pilots. Japanese aviators who survived long enough to recognize the pattern found themselves in a machine optimized for a style of combat their opponents had deliberately abandoned. Its elegance was inseparable from its vulnerability. 30. Macchi MC 200 Seta, Italy, 1937. Italy's Macchi MC-200 was an aerodynamically refined fighter, but it was cursed by the same problem that afflicted most Regia Aeronautica fighters of the period: an engine too weak to compete with contemporary British and American aircraft. The Fiat A74 Radial gave it a top speed that fell well short of the Hurricanes and Spitfires it encountered over Malta and North Africa. Pilots flying the MC-200 were often skilled and aggressive, but they understood that their opponents had a performance margin that could be exploited at will. The aircraft's handling was generally considered pleasant, which made the gap between pilot quality and machine capability all the more frustrating. Italian fighter pilots consistently outperformed what their equipment suggested they should be capable of, but in a war where performance envelopes mattered acutely, the MC-200's engine limitations cost pilots engagements they had no mechanical means to win. If you know an aircraft that pilots hated even more, tell us in the comments below. And for more World War II aviation stories, rankings, and forgotten machines, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.